opportunity.
But as Dennis Waltering tells us in this 4 Investigates report, some researchers believe that dangerous levels of lead exposure could be just another part of the cause.
It's a disturbing scene that's much too familiar. New Orleans police investigating yet another murder. Could the violent behavior that led to this homicide be tracked to the hidden poison of lead exposure that endangers the youngest children in many parts of the city? Increasing evidence indicates that's very likely.
What my research shows is that there is an extremely strong relationship between the rise and fall in lead exposure and the rise and fall of crime, with a time lag that reflects the typical age of offenders, suggesting some sort of an interaction.
Economist Rick Nevins, a consultant to the National Center for Healthy Housing, has investigated the connection between crime and lead exposure in the United States and in 8 European countries.
The relationship is just stunningly consistent.
He says crime jumps dramatically when a population exposed to dangerous levels of lead as babies reaches adulthood.
My first study showed that the murder rate in the United States from 1900 through 1960 rose and fell, and I mean by a huge margin, from 1 per 100,000 to 10 per 100,000, then back down to 5, tracking the rise and fall of paint lead use with a 21-year time lag.
How widespread is lead exposure in New Orleans?
The inner cities are extremely highly contaminated with lead.
30 years after lead paint was banned in homes, and 22 years after lead was banned in gasoline, Dr. Howard Milkey of Tulane and Xavier's Center for Bioenvironmental Research says the soils of inner-city New Orleans are contaminated with dangerous levels of lead.
The amounts of lead here, these communities have a median of about 1,000 parts per million.
That's more than twice the EPA guideline of 400 parts per million. The darker the red on this map, the higher the reading. And Milkey says his research shows children should not play in soil that's even as low as 100 parts per million.
So this is a very highly contaminated area.
Milkey says most older large cities have the same kind of hidden lead poison. He says the lead dust in the soil comes from lead paint and from gasoline that pumped huge quantities of lead aerosol into the air before it was banned in 1986.
Any part of the city where you have a lot of automobiles and very high traffic flows, we find very large amounts of lead.
Why is lead exposure potentially so harmful for small children? Dr. Milkey says in the first few years of life, children are crawling, picking up dust, have a lot of hand-to-mouth activity, and don't have the metabolic processes necessary to eliminate lead.
So they tend to absorb it, and it goes into the blood and into the bone, and it affects the brain especially.
It causes a problem with the development, it causes a problem with IQ and learning, and in some cases can be permanent.
Basically, my children have permanent brain damage.
Tamara Rubin says her 3 boys suffered lead poisoning when a contractor who claimed to know how to remove lead paint from her home safely used one of the most dangerous methods possible, open flame torch burning.
With open flame torch burning in particular, you can just inhale the lead fumes and be instantly poisoned as a result of that.
She says her children suddenly became violently ill with diarrhea and vomiting. The doctor finally tested the youngest, just 7 months old at the time, for lead poisoning.
And a couple days later, we got a call in the middle of the night from a doctor saying you have to move out of your house immediately. Your child has severe, acute lead poisoning.
Tamara Rubin of Oregon was in New Orleans recently urging parents to test their children for lead poisoning and warning the impact of lead poisoning on children can be devastating.
IQ loss, learning disabilities, behavioral disorders, aggression. My 3-year-old is among the most aggressive 3-year-olds that I know.
Howard Milkey examined achievement in school among 4th graders here in New Orleans and found strong evidence that lead exposure damages learning ability.
We find that the best achievement is taking place in the low lead areas of the city, and the worst achievement is occurring in the high lead areas of the city.
It's scary because you don't know what can happen to your kid.
Here in Mid-City, Juan and Jennifer Molina had a couple of lead poisoning scares with their youngest son, Miguel.
The pediatrician told me 10 and above is high, and I think his might have been, 19 or something like that.
She says the doctor recommended extra thorough house cleaning to remove any dust, and Miguel's blood lead levels did come down. Then they were away while the house was painted and came back to find a lot of dust And the hyper-energetic puppy they used to have was barely willing or able to move.
He wouldn't even get up, and he was vomiting, and there was obviously something wrong with him. So
the dog had lead poisoning and had to go through a process to remove metal from the blood called chelation. And Miguel's blood lead went up again.
Something that you don't know is there, and it's dangerous to your family, especially to your kid.
Juan Molina replaced the topsoil in their yard. They once again cleaned their home extensively. The activist group Acorn did a lead test of their home and returned later for this remediation to make it lead safe.
Now that, thank God, our kids' levels are down, we feel more...
They seem to be okay. Huh?
Yeah, they're acting okay, they're seeing okay.
Dr. Milkey says recent studies show lead exposure affects up to 30% of the children in inner-city New Orleans. How are city officials responding?
In this project, we're planting sunflowers. Sunflowers take up lead from the soil.
The city is researching ways to use sunflowers to remove lead from the soil. Dr. Earthia Nance says the city will put together a citizen's guide to show people how to use sunflowers to safely remove lead from their yards. And she wants people to be able to find out if their soil is contaminated.
We want there to be a place where people can go and get their soils tested to find out the extent of if there's any contamination.
If we want to make sure we have healthy children in our community, we have to deal with the lead issue.
Howard Milkey says mud from the Mississippi River called alluvium offers another inexpensive way to fight lead contamination.
We discovered that the alluvium coming from the river was a very clean material.
He and his team trucked in river mud from the Bonnie Carey spillway to cover the contaminated soil on the lots where these homes have since been built here in Central City.
The lead levels increased tremendously from 800 parts per million all the way down to about 10 parts per million.
With a good grass cover, it means that this area should be child safe.
Milkey says it would probably cost $300 million or more to use this approach to decontaminate the most affected areas of the city. But he asks, how much more is lead exposure already costing the city in reduced learning ability, increased violent crime, and permanently damaged children? Dennis Woltering, Eyewitness News, Night Watch.
Special